Okay. Okay. So we are going to talk a little bit about Sigmund Freud's structural model. Okay, so this is what this is here. You guys have probably, this is the German version. So this is the cool German version that you don't normally see. But basically what this is, the bottom here, this is the drives, S, right? This is the ego up here. This is superego, ich, ego, ich, superego. And you can see that part of the ego, the important thing to get from this diagram is part of the ego and part of the superego are both unconscious. Okay? So not everything we do, not all of our cognitive processes are conscious, right? I'm driving over here today in the rain, I see a stop sign, I just put my foot on the brake and stop the car. I don't really think about it, right? It becomes an automatic thing that I do. Well, that's the ego sort of keeping me alive, right? But it's not necessarily conscious. Okay. Likewise with the superego is all these kind of, superego has two parts. The first part is, the prohibitions and sense of right or wrong that we internalize from our parents at a very young age. That's the first part. The second part is the ideal, what the best who we can be, the best thing that we could be, the best person that we could be. That's the ego ideal. And that's a very interesting thing that maybe I'll talk a little bit more later about if I have time, because it actually plays a large part in group psychology. It's actually kind of interesting. But it's basically, what we're sort of working towards or what is pulling us upward. For instance, all of you probably have something in your ego ideal about wanting to help people, that you want to be somebody who helps people. It's part of your ego ideal. That's why you come into this profession, right? So, this idea of, what's pulling you forward. If you're Jungian, it's what's pulling you forward. If you're Freudian, what's pushing you toward, the best version of yourself that you could possibly be, okay? All right, so here's another model, maybe a little more, you can see this. So again, this is in English, so a little easier to see. You can see here's all the pleasure principle. We'll include aggression in here as well. These are the drives that are pushing up. The ego then modulates these, right? Modulates these. If you want to think of these things as emotions, right? These are emotions, pleasurable emotions, non-pleasurable emotions, aggressive emotions. These are, and you can think of the ego component as modulating these, because this is actually what occurs in the brain, right? That you have areas of the brain in the cortex, mostly frontal cortex here, that modulates emotional states. And then you've got this superego thing here, which has a little bit to do with both. It both modulates emotional states, but also has to do with sort of navigating reality, because your sense of right or wrong helps you navigate reality. So in a sense, these components can work together. They also can be at odds with one another, right? At odds with one another. So the superego can be at odds with whatever the primary pleasure process is. I just want some money. I want to go buy whatever I want. So I'm going to go rob the bank. But the superego is saying that's wrong. You shouldn't do that, right? The sense of that being wrong. And the ego is the one that's sort of like, well, if I'm going to rob the bank, how am I going to do it, right? And so the ego can be at odds with the superego, or it can be aligned with the superego. And again, it's modulating these emotional states. So there are aspects of the brain that correspond to each of these things. And this is this whole area of neuropsychoanalysis that I mentioned before that people are really talking about now. And if we have time a little later on, I can do a little mini lecture on that. Super interesting. And people have made a lot more progress on it than I thought. So I didn't realize that people really have been working on this quite a bit. So there's actually a couple of books out about this neuropsychoanalysis stuff. So this is actually really quite interesting. But anyway, for now, don't worry about that. Just realize this is sort of the model here. This goes on. And again, psychic energy originates in the unconscious, but I'm going to be biological about it and say this stuff this all comes out of our biology. It's basic biology. It's basic, natural selection, Darwinian survival. It comes out. You need pleasure. because that reinforces you for doing things, and you need aggression because that's how you eat and protect yourself. And all animals, even bugs, have these things. You can just see a bug walking across the ground, and it's going to do the same things. So these, to me, are very biological. I think of these in terms of evolution. So that's my take on it. Other people would disagree with that, so that's fine. But just so you know, like I ground this stuff into biology. I think that's important. And when we get to talking about personality disorders, you'll see that comes up again, because a lot of the things we're going to say about how this stuff is sort of processed, or how it gets, the processing gets derailed in personality disorders, has a real biological component to it. And that will, especially when we talk about borderline personality disorder, I'll talk to you about some of the evolutionary psychology takes on that, which has to relate to how this stuff is processed. So we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so again, this is just what I just said here. Three sections of the structural model, Freud's structural model: id, which is the drives, eros and thanatos, pleasure and aggression, ego and superego. Okay, Freud said the id, the drives are present at birth, container of inherited sexual and aggressive instincts and drives. There's a lot of translation issues with how that instinct or drive is translated. Don't worry about that. Okay. One thing that Freud said is that eros is trying to make unities, trying to unify things and preserve things, and thanatos is trying to break things down, and destroy things. So that's one way Freud looked at this. It's interesting. I also teach a class on Asian philosophy, and if you look in Hinduism, for instance, there's a trinity in Hinduism, right? You have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, right? Brahma is the creator, the originator. He doesn't get paid much attention to, but Vishnu is the maintainer, the unifier, and Shiva is the destroyer, right? And so you all saw Oppenheimer, the movie, right? And Oppenheimer comes out and says, I am the destroyer of worlds, right? That's a quote from Shiva, right? So Shiva is the destroyer of worlds, the destroyer, and Vishnu is the maintainer and the unifier, the creator, or not the creator, but the maintainer, the unifier, keeps things together, right? So it's interesting that you see that echoed in this Eastern religion in Hinduism. It's kind of fascinating, and you could probably find other correlates in other philosophies or religious systems as well. So Freud is sort of tapping into something that's almost kind of a universal thing that's out there, just not put in the psychology realm, but more in the philosophy or religious realm. Now, there are psychoanalytic theorists and practitioners from more relational schools who don't really think that talking about these drives or instincts really has much clinical utility, because basically what they're doing is they're basically saying that the human motivation is to be in relationships, and that being in a relationship is the thing that really needs to be analyzed and looked at. And that's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing that, and that's perfectly fine, except for me personally, I like to feel that the motivation for being in relationships also comes out of eros and thanatos. So again, it depends how far back you want to go and work with. And in some cases, I think it's good to work with eros and thanatos, and to work with a person and examine what their drives are, what the drives are motivating them to do, besides just being in a relationship. But a lot of people go into therapy because they're having relationship problems, either romantic relationships or work relationships. And so a more relational psychoanalytic practitioner would say, well, let's just cut to the chase and get right to the relationship stuff. Let's talk about that, because again, the relationship with the therapist to a large degree is what affects the cure. So why bother with all this other stuff? We'll just get right down to it and start dealing with relationship stuff. And that's not wrong. And it's something any psychoanalytic practitioner would do. Even a drive person like myself would do that. But I also keep an eye open for the drive stuff, where the pleasure seeking is, where the wish fulfillment is, and where the aggression is. And I find that to be helpful. Not everybody does. But and that's okay. But you will see a split among psychoanalytic schools, among the more relational schools versus the ones who have the more of the drive stuff. And then the object relation school that I come from really does both. It's really kind of in the middle. It really does both. And you could be a little more one way or the other, but really both things are there. And again, it's the relationship that cures. So that's what you're going to be, that's going to be focusing, especially the transference between the therapist and the patient, and the therapist, the transference. That's really where a lot of the healing is going to take place. Okay? All right. Thanatos, we talked about, we can really just think about it as a capacity for aggression. And again, this is, really fundamentally about either getting food or protecting yourself from being somebody else's food. Those are the real things. It's why we have aggression. And, we can break down aggression into more categories. I'm doing that in my new book. I'm going to use Conrad Lawrence's wrote a book called On Aggression. It's very interesting. And he breaks down 4 types of aggression. And, you can break it down even more. It's not necessary for this class, but if anybody's interested in that, I'm happy to talk to you about that later on. But again, this is something we see in even basic animals, maybe even in plants too. There's this idea that plants send out chemicals and attack each other and things. So, there's strong evolutionary pressure in most animals to defend themselves and or to be able to sort of kill to get their dinner, right? So, it wasn't too long ago in our history as human beings where when you were hungry, you didn't just go over to, cross the freeway here at Whole Foods and just go to the meat section and get yourself a steak or some chicken sausages or whatever, or vegan meat or whatever you want to eat, but you had to go out and actually find something that was running around and spear it or shoot it in order to to get your dinner, right? It wasn't too long ago. I mean, maybe a couple hundred years, people were doing that. There weren't refrigerators. How long have we had refrigerators? Probably since the early 1900s. And before that, we had ice. You know why it's called an ice box, right? Because back in the day, your refrigerator was a cabinet that you put big block chunks of ice into, and that's how you refrigerated your food. And when I lived in Boston, I lived very near a pond, and it was an ice pond. And people would go in the winter, and they would crack open the ice, and they would get big chunks of ice, and they would take them to these insulated warehouses and keep them there for the whole year. And about half of it would melt, and they would have ice, through the summer, and that was a whole business. They would even take ice and from Boston, from the ice pond, and put it into ships and send the ships down to like Florida or the Caribbean and put the ice in warehouses, and people would have ice, to make their drinks cool, down in the warmer places. So that was actually a thing, and it wasn't until I think early 1900s that once they figured out principles of thermodynamics, that they were able to figure out how to make refrigerators, which is a whole nother side thing. I won't go off on that topic, but it's very interesting because it relates to this stuff, right? When you have refrigerators, then you can start, storing food, and you can, people don't have to go out and get fresh food by hunting every day. They can, store stuff. People can go out and, do things like that. So anyway, the idea that we didn't have to go out and kill our food is fairly new in human history. So, you might ask the question, now is our aggression being channeled in other places? We need to express it somehow. We have that drive, that emotional state. We need to express it. How does it get expressed now that we don't have to go out and kill our food, or we're not always defending ourselves, in the same ways that we did? And I would say this stuff gets expressed symbolically instead. And that's a whole nother lecture. I think it's really quite interesting. And again, that's something, if you want to talk about, happy to talk to you more about, because again, this is what I'm sort of writing a book about. So I'm thinking about a lot of this stuff right now. But I think it's worth thinking about how the aggression becomes symbolized in people's lives. When people come to therapy, how are they manifesting these aggressive drives, right? And I think this is interesting, especially you see people who sabotage themselves. They always seem to be doing something and screwing something up. Maybe they're doing really well, but they can't tolerate it, so they sabotage themselves. That's something you'll see a lot, when you're doing therapy with people. And I guess if you're a CBT person, you'll say, well, there's some erroneous thoughts going on. But remember, I told you psychoanalytic therapy is, ECBT, right? ECBT, emotional cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So, we want to examine what's going on emotionally with the person. How's this aggressive, drive sort of manifesting as emotions? How does it manifest symbolically in the person's life? How is this sort of, relate to what they're coming into therapy for. If they're doing self-sabotage, or they can't keep a job because they fly off the handle, whatever it might be, you'll see some of that stuff, as therapists, that'll come up. So I think it's an important thing to look at. Okay. All right. We call the action of the drives, the eros and the thanatos, we call that the primary process. You'll sometimes see that term around. That just means all that stuff bubbling up, the aggression and the pleasure seeking bubbling up. Okay. Okay. All right. I talked about this already. The Relational People. Very good book, by the way. Some articles by Mitchell. There's also a book on object relations therapy by Greenberg and Mitchell, which is basically kind of tends to be more relational, but very good book. And this is perfectly good stuff. You can look into the stuff, but I think it does a little bit of a disservice. I like to do both, so that's where I'm gonna say. Okay, so let's talk about ego a little bit. Ego is, you guys know about the ego because you do a lot of cognitive stuff, but the ego is basically the idea the ego helps to modulate these emotional states. And it also does cognition, and it is something that allows human beings, and it evolved for us to really allow us to move through the world in a very powerful way, that we can regulate our emotional states and we can think up things that really help us survive, right? So if you want to think of the ego evolutionarily, think of it as something that evolved to help us survive. So I have a theory, and I have no basis for this theory, so you can really take this with a big grain of salt, but I have a theory that if you look at other primates, like for instance chimpanzees, that they may have something that is like an ego but is less evolved than the human ego. It's not as functional as a human ego, and that whatever evolutionary pressures human beings, hominids, faced, allowed us to develop this sort of psychic structure, this ego structure, which correlates to basically the part of the brain, the frontal cortex of the brain, that have a more highly developed cortex than other primates. And there was probably some evolutionary pressure for that. There's different theories about what that evolutionary pressure was, but we end up having a more complicated cortex that does more regulation of emotional states than perhaps, for instance, chimpanzees. And so you can think of human beings having a more, mature, normal human being having, good ego strength, good cognitive function, good emotional regulation function, as something that you wouldn't see the same level as chimpanzees. Usually when we look at chimpanzees, we think, oh yeah, we're smarter than they are. Chimpanzee, I think, what was it I read somewhere that chimpanzee roughly is cognitive processing power of like a 4-year-old human, right? Something like that, it's like a 4-year-old. But it's also interesting to think about emotional regulation, that chimpanzees may not have as much emotional regulation ability as human beings, also because they don't have as much cortex. And so the idea that, chimpanzees may be, functioning at the level of kind of like borderline personality organization, which we'll talk about what that is. But, one thing to think about, chimpanzees may be sort of like borderline. They may function like a human being with personality disorders, where emotional regulation is not very good. They tend to fly off the handle. They tend to, have a lot of lability and emotions. They can go one to the other, very quickly. And so it's a speculation that I have, also in the new book. I'm speculating about that. I'm sure somebody's going to rabidly object to that and say you're full of crap. There's no evidence for this stuff. There really isn't any. I couldn't find much evidence. I looked around to see if there's any literature on this. There's not much out there. But if anybody's looking for a thesis idea, let me tell you, this would be a really good one, and it would be very controversial, and it would put you on the map as far as doing some research on this stuff. I do have a colleague at Channel Islands who goes down to the zoo and studies primates, and so I could hook you up with him. Maybe he would help you. I don't know, but it's an interesting thought. Okay, so again, but the idea here is that you want to think of the ego as also not just doing cognitions and coming up with thoughts that may be good or bad, but also as regulating emotional states. So that's important. One of the things that we want And again, I don't know enough about CBT. Maybe CBT deals with that, but we want to be thinking about emotional states and regulation of emotions too. Okay. All right. So Freud said, "Where id was, there ego shall be." And Freud and Jung both said, the idea of psychotherapy is to make what is unconscious conscious. And to some degree, that makes a lot of sense. Whether it's your consciousness of maladaptive thought patterns, or whether it's your consciousness of maladaptive emotional patterns or relationship patterns, when you take the stuff that you're not aware of and you become aware of it, that is part of what affects the cure in therapy. Okay? And that's basically what he's saying. Okay. And I think that's as true today as it was back in Freud's day. And again, there are unconscious parts of the ego as well, right? Like I talked to you about, like, driving my car over here. I'm not really conscious what I'm doing. I'm just sort of driving along, right? But the ego is using rationality. Okay? The ego is the rational process. And the term for this in the Freudian world is called secondary process. Primary process is the drives. Secondary processes are ego stuff. And that's dealing with the reality of the external world. Has to do with keeping yourself safe, keeping yourself alive, and also regulating your emotional stuff. Okay. And emotional and psychic energy associated with Eros and Thanatos, to some degree, according to Freud, is stored up in the ego, right? You take that stuff, you store it in the ego, use it to sort of think of it as sort of powers the ego. It's the battery for the ego, right? But then again, if too much is coming through, the ego has to then regulate that emotion, has to defend against being overwhelmed by it. And that's where you get defense mechanisms. And we'll have a whole lecture just on defense mechanisms. Okay. All right. And then Freud talked about how I don't want to talk to you too much about primary narcissism, because that's kind of a term that's a little old fashioned. That's sort of been dropped now. But the idea is that originally Freud said, a baby comes into the world, it's kind of cathected or basically connected to itself without any sort of connection to anything else outside. And we know now from child development research that's not really true. And most Freudians now have dropped the idea of primary narcissism. And I think I'll talk to you a little bit about that later on. Okay. But the ego does, the ego develops in the infant, and it does start to cathect. Cathect means connect to things, images or internalized representations of people outside, again, starting with the mothering person. And this transforms, according to old school Freud, a connection to oneself, this narcissistic feelings, to starting connecting the feelings to other people. And we know now that infants, right from the beginning, are able to start connecting to other people, especially the mothering person. So we sort of, this primary narcissism sort of dropped out of favor, right? But this idea of connecting the libido, which is the pleasurable and aggressive energy, another word for id, libido, also gets connected to other person, and also gets connected to body areas, right? And this is where we go through, according to Freud, we go through these developmental stages where the libido, and Freud's talking at this point, he's not really, at this point when he's writing this stuff, he hasn't really introduced the aggressive stuff in there, but we can add it in ourselves, where you have oral, anal, phallic zones, right, in the body, where the libido, the pleasure and the aggression sort of centers around. Okay. And so that's the important thing. We're going to talk about development in a little bit, hopefully today, maybe. Superego, I also talked to you already about. Sense of morality functions as our conscience. When we talk about people with antisocial personality disorder later on, we'll be able to say they don't, their superego development is really highly impaired, right? They don't have a sense of conscience, not consciousness, conscience, what's good or right or wrong, right? They just do whatever they want to do to get whatever it is they want to get, without thinking about, whether it's going to hurt or bother other people. Okay. Freud thought of the superego as sort of the strict father, kind of, father back in the day would have been the one who laid down the law, and this is the morality. I think we can widen that out a little bit now, a little bit. Okay. All right. Let's see about that. more about the superego. Sometimes it's inner voice. It's sort of the internalization of your parents telling you what's right from wrong. And I don't know any of you have any kids. If you have kids, you'll get a sense of, it's very interesting. You'll get a sense of when your kid is starting to develop a sense of a superego, because first, when they're very small, they'll look to you to see whether they did something right or wrong. And you'll say, that was wrong. You did bad, you messed something up, right? And later on, you'll see the kid will start doing it themselves. They'll know they did something bad. And there's kind of really interesting developmental stage where the child has the realization where they've done something either good or bad, right? Also can be when they've done something good, they've done something good or they've done something bad. And again, if you are a behaviorist, you will see that there's definitely some reinforcement that also gets reinforced. It's not just internal things, but these internal processes also get reinforced by what's going on in the outside world, right? We know a little bit of this from research, right? That if you grow up in a family of criminals, right, that what you consider to be right or wrong may be different than somebody who grows up in a family of non-criminals, right? In a criminal world, maybe you grow up in a family of pickpockets, and pickpocketing is the way we make our living, and so that's okay. And the child's sense of right or wrong is not necessarily a universal thing, but is a bit what they get reinforced for. So again, I'm going to be behavioral about this. I mean, so the superego has a lot to do with what the child is reinforced for, what right or wrong the child internalizes from the parent, right? And so you'll see some differences in morality, depending on where the child grows up, what the culture is like. Now, that said, I'll speak out of the other side of my mouth and say we also can see that there are some more moral things that seem to be more or less universal among human beings. And again, this is a whole nother, we could have a whole class just on this. And some people have written books on this, on morality and how morality develops and the evolution of morality, why we evolved to have certain moral standards, because this also can confer fitness on us as human beings, right? And there's all this game theory about this stuff, and it's really, really fascinating. It's a little bit off the track for this class, so I'm not something I'm going to go into, but it is something that is really super interesting. And if you're interested in that, let me know, and I'll give you some resources you can read about that. But this is all related to what Freud would have called the superego. Okay, so the superego also relates to this idea of Oedipal complex that we're going to talk about, the fear of what can happen to you if you do something wrong. This gets internalized in the child. And, again, the idea, a lot of it relates to Freud's, view relates to the father, but it really could relate to the father or the mother. But, Freud's view, the old school, it's the father, and it's the son who fears, the fear is they fear being castrated because they want to kill daddy and have mommy. And so they feel, the fantasy is that the father is going to know this and then will kill or castrate them, right? And this is the nucleus around which, sort of, for Freud, this is sort of where the nucleus around the Oedipal complex comes out of the sort of superego. I would say, as a more modern psychoanalytic person, I would say the superego is going to come first, and then you're going to see the Oedipal complex later. I think for Freud it was a little more like the superego sort of is there, but really develops fully around the Oedipal developmental age. But I think now, I would say personally that I think it's developing a lot earlier than that. Okay, but again, you will see this, and again, this is something you can observe in children. You can observe this sort of fear. And again, this is a little bit the Oedipal age 4 or 5 years old. Child's already developed. They're really developing a sense of what's right or wrong. Right. And you'll see that in them. You'll see them know they don't have to refer back to you. They know they did something wrong, right? They know it was wrong. And they have a fear of what's going to happen to them. They have a fear of punishment. And so you'll see this sort of develop around this time. Mm-hmm. And the idea here is that the superego confers evolutionary fitness because it allows for human beings to have more successful social interactions. And if you think about game theory, about a lot, I don't know if you guys know about game theory, but the game theory is like has a lot to do with how humans interact with each other, and how humans can most efficiently get what they want, from each other and with each other, right? And so again, the idea that superego, having rules and moral standards, allows human beings to get along and to do things more successfully together in a group, which is again one of the reasons why human beings are so successful, because we're able to do things, make group projects, and then we've got a nice big ego that has all these cognitive functions. We can, big imaginations, we can think up all these things, and then we can marshal other people together to help us accomplish things. And so you can see the superego has some evolutionary advantage there. It gives us some evolutionary advantage, at least when it's functioning properly. Okay, so there's lots of relationship between these things. Freud had this wonderful metaphor that the relationship between the id and the ego was that between a horse and a rider. The horse is the id, it's just the energy, and the rider is the ego, who is directing the energy and making it useful, making it go somewhere useful in a useful way. Freud didn't use the superego in this analogy, but we can add the superego into the analogy, and let's put a fence around the location where the horse and the rider are present. So the horse is the energy and the rider is directing that, but there's a fence around where the horse can go, right? There's some limitations, there's some what's the word I want to use? There's some sort of inhibition about where the horse goes. The horse can't just go anywhere, right? The horse has to go within this fenced-in area, right? So there's a restriction on where the horse can travel. So the ego can ride the horse directly around, but there's some restriction on where that can go. So you think of the fence as the superego. Does that make sense to you guys? That's the analogy I'm going to use. I think that's a pretty, I don't know, I like this analogy, right? So the aim of psychoanalytic therapy is to help the writer understand the nature of his or her horse's impulses, right? That's the drive stuff. That's the stuff I like, right? And to develop better and newer skills, new ego functions, to make the riding the horse become a better rider. Ride the horse more smoothly, less dangerous, more enjoyable, more adaptive. That's probably a little bit where that area is where sort of the CBT stuff would be doing, right? And also, psychoanalytic therapy would allow the writer to make changes in the location of fences, either to extend where the fence goes or to close in the fence where there's holes in it, but to understand where the fence is, or make the fence something that helps the person adapt to whatever that is that they want to be doing with their lives, right? Make the fence appropriate to what's going on in the person's life, and or what they would becoming the best person that they could be, their ego ideal, right? It's related to that, where that fence is, right? So you want to expand the fence to the point where you're able to achieve your goals and become the person you want to be. And so that also therapy will help with that. So this is the metaphor. I like this metaphor. I think it's, if I was trying to explain to a patient, what the therapy process was, this is the metaphor I would use. I would say, this is what we're going to be talking about, right? And again, if you're an old school psychoanalytic therapist, like the woman I worked with, you would actually, the old school social workers, they would actually educate the patients about what the process was. And I think there's some utility for that, especially if you're doing something a little more short-term therapy. You want to this is what we're going to do, and then now once I explain this to you, now we're going to just say whatever comes to your mind. I'm going to be more neutral, but to explain what the sort of function of the therapy is, I think this is a good metaphor. And again, this personality structure. So again, you can break this down, right? We all looked at this thing already. Okay, this looks pretty simplistic, but if you really want to get into detail, you can really start breaking this down into looking at all the things that come along here, and including in developmental levels and all sorts of stuff that relates to these things here. Becomes a little bit more complicated. So again, we're not going into detail about this, but just so you know that this actually can become a lot more complicated. And the one thing we didn't talk about that's really important in the Freudian world is anxiety. Because anxiety is what signals the ego that the regulation of these emotional states, of these drives, is not going along as it should. Like that the ego can be overwhelmed by the drives, by the emotions, and so that signals anxiety, and that causes the ego then to manifest defenses against the stuff bubbling up, right? And this is where the defense. So anxiety is very important in Freudian psychotherapy. And again, if you guys know you're doing psychotherapy, you'll know that anxiety is, people coming into therapy almost always are manifesting some level of anxiety. There's some anxiety that shows up. And so again, that tells us that the regulation process going on is not functioning as well as it could, right? So that gives you some idea that the regulation ability of the person's ego regulation's not really functioning as well as it should. So if you are doing short-term psychodynamic therapy, psychoanalytic therapy, what you'll do is you'll shore up the ego functions. You'll work with the ego functions. You'll shore this up. That is a lot like CBT, at least what I know about CBT. It's very similar. There's a lot of similarities to CBT and sort of the ego, bolstering ego functions, right? And this is what these ego psychologists, the psychoanalytic ego psychologists, that was their main thing. And that's the branch, as I mentioned before, that was championed by Anna Freud, right? But you bolster these ego things. And actually, if you're going to do more short-term work, that's kind of what you would do, right? And it kind of makes sense, right? And that's why you see CBT is, tends to be a short-term therapy. That's what you do. That's where you can get some results in the short term, right? Because maybe you can't deal with these things being overwhelming, but what you can do is get the ego to function better, get the defenses function better, and get the person sort of stabilized there, right? And then if you're going to be longer into therapy, then you can start working on these other things where this other stuff's coming from, you with all these other stuff, but you want to stabilize this ego stuff, right? So that's one way to think about it. And we're going to talk about the defense mechanisms in a bit here. Okay, that's all for that lecture. Any questions on that? I know that was very quick, but I wanted to get through it. Any questions anybody has? And I stop sharing this for a second. Anna, you're in class. Any questions? I'll just look to you to ask questions since you're here. Everybody else has their microphones off. So does that make sense to you guys? That following? Okay, good. Okay. All right. Well, let's go on to the next. What's the next thing I want to talk about? We'll take a break here. Wait a minute. Where are we? Okay. Here, okay. Okay, that's the core. So that's the core ideas in psychotherapy. All right, so I think we've got through the first week's worth of stuff. Okay, let's talk about. You guys want to do some nuts and bolts stuff? Should we do some nuts and bolts stuff first? Let's do some nuts and bolts stuff. Out here. Oh my gosh. Figure out how to do this. Okay, here we go. Nuts and bolts stuff. Well, it's in here somewhere. Okay. So let's talk about nuts and bolts stuff here. So let's talk a little bit about the just the bare bones. So you got a little bit of background now about psychoanalytic psychotherapy, kind of how it functions. Let's talk about how you actually set up your office. What do you do? You show up to work and you have some kind of an office and you go in there and you do something. So what do you do? What do you do? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts. Because the psychoanalytic clinician's office is really important. This is almost one of the tools, the instruments that you are going to be using. Oh, wait a minute. You guys can't even see this yet. Sorry. Hold on. You guys got to go back and tell me that I'm not doing something right. Because I will just go on. Hold on. Let me share the screen. All right. Okay. Now you guys can see this, right? weren't even going to tell me. Okay.
Yes.
Now you can see it. Okay, good. All right. Move this thing, man. Move this over here. Okay. So the psychoanalytic clinician's office is really a tool. It's a tool that you're going to be using to do your work. And so it's actually really important how you do the office. And I'm showing you some examples of different therapy offices here. I'm sure you guys have seen many of these. This one in the bottom here, this is the full analytic office. There's the couch. You lie on the couch facing away from the therapist. Therapist is here, analyst is here, and you free associate, right? Here you have your chair, the facing chairs. This is probably more what you're used to. Here you've got a little bit more flexibility. Here you got a little more flexibility. Notice the tissues there. Always good to have a box of tissues. I'm sure you all know that. But the office is really this is really going to be your tool, one of your main therapeutic tools. And it's really an extension of you as the therapist. And it's also something to hold something that you all should be developing now, which is your therapeutic identity, your identity of yourself as a therapist, as the therapist. And that's something that is super important, like your therapeutic identification, your identity of you as a therapist. Should that be different than you as, a normal civilian person? From a psychoanalytic point of view, strictly yes. The answer is yes. From a personal view, I would, from an existentialist point of view, I would say no. And so somewhere in between those extremes is where you are going to be, where your habitation will be in your life. It's very good. I can say this as the son of a psychoanalyst. And anybody else here have psychotherapy, like psychotherapist parents?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, so you'll relate to this. It's really good to be able to turn off your psychotherapy switch. Put it in the off position is very useful. And if you have psychotherapists as parents, you'll realize that sometimes they don't always turn their psychotherapy switch in the off position, and every interaction with them is like dealing with a therapist. Really annoying. I don't know if you've had that experience or not, but again, having a psychoanalyst as a father, I can say, just put it in the off position. I'm done with it, right? The only thing worse is having your other parent being an attorney, and and my mom was an attorney and a judge. And so you can imagine what that was like, like everything, getting the interrogation from the judge when you get home, right? So, I think those are occupational hazards. And when you guys become psychotherapists and you have children, I would highly, highly recommend you have an off switch. It's just my personal belief from my personal experience. You want an off switch. Okay. I don't know. Kia, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it's funny what you said as well, because my stepmom's also a judge. And so I feel you on both counts.
There you go. Yeah. So, so develop your therapeutic identity, develop your own personal identity, know what the differences between those things are. And we're going to talk about neutrality in the next lecture, which is super important. Therapeutic neutrality, know about that, and know when to turn that off and when to turn it on. Really super important, just for you to have a good life. To be important, because if you're therapeutically neutral with your family and your friends, you're not going to have many friends. You need to turn it off. And you guys already know about confidentiality, and we don't really go too much into that, though we will talk a little bit about that, because there's some wrinkles with that now in the online world that we have to deal with that we didn't have to deal with before. But just so you know, it's really important that you have a therapeutic identity. Okay, think of yourself as a therapist, but also keep in mind who you are as a person, and you'll work out the tension between those things. That's just part of becoming a therapist. Okay. Freud said it's the impossible profession. And he really was right. It really is the impossible profession, especially when you're using your personality as the instrument, right? And that is psychoanalytic psychotherapy. It's why I think some people don't like to do psychoanalytic psychotherapy, because it requires you to use your personality as an instrument. And to do that, you really need to go through a course of psychotherapy yourself. It's much easier just to do something where you learn a technique and you just go do a technique on somebody. Like, I think I look at these people who do EMDR, eye movement desensitization. I'm jealous because, like, God, I always show up at the office. I have a technique. I just do the technique on them and I send them home, and it's great. It helps them. And I don't have to use my personality as a tool, which can be exhausting, right? I can just do this thing, like look at this, look up here, whatever they're doing, the tapping, whatever the eye movement stuff is. I have relatives who are therapists who do EMDR, and they really like it a lot. I'm like, I should learn to do that. That's a really good, make my life easier, but this kind of therapy requires you to use your, psychoanalytic psychotherapy requires you to use your personality to some degree as a tool. Now, that also can be an impetus for you to develop yourself to become more aware just as a person in general. I don't want to say could be a spiritual practice, but maybe it's something akin to a spiritual practice. You may be a notch below a spiritual practice, but it can be something that you can use to develop your awareness of yourself. And so there are some other side benefits to being a therapist. I don't want to make it sound like it's all bad, because there are, when you work with other people and you're working with stuff, you'll have lots of realizations about yourself, which could be very helpful. Okay. Did I talk to you about the couch versus the chair yet? Was that you guys I talked to, or my other class?
You touched up on it.
I touched up on that. Okay. So the couch is a key signifier of psychoanalysis. If you become a psychoanalyst and somebody comes for psychoanalytic treatment, you put them on the couch. The patient reclines away from you. You can see this picture here. This is typical. You sit behind them or over to the side where they can't see you. You're not in their vision. They free associate. This facilitates the patient free associating. And then you take notes, and then you can make some sort of comments, you can make interpretations, but you're not like getting that face-to-face thing. And the idea here is that the patient can relax more, the patient can go into more or less a hypnagogic state. You know what that is? A hypnagogic state? That's like kind of like you're not quite hypnotized, but you're sort of a twilight, of conscious, not asleep and you're not awake, you're sort of in between. And this is where a lot of the inhibitory things, the things that inhibit your unconscious expression, kind of soften up a little bit. So when you free associate, things can start to come out. And this is why the couch is useful, right? Helps you relax. Now, according to some analysts, some writers, the reason that Freud used the couch, he didn't like to be looked at all day. So there is that too, that, this facilitates you as the therapist, maybe in a way, keeping your energy, right? That, the idea, again, this is also another Hindu idea, the idea that you could lose energy through people staring at you all day. It's related to the Hindu idea of darshan, which we're not going to go into, but this idea that, you can energy can leak out of your eyes. You're staring at somebody all day, that can become very tiring. And so this is also maybe part of why the couch evolved in psychoanalysis. Okay. So for psychoanalysts, using the couch is a central technique. As I think I told you, when I was doing psychoanalytic psychotherapy with a psychoanalyst, she just put me on the couch, right away. So, again, it is a way you can do psychotherapy with people. However, you really will only find psychoanalysts doing psychotherapy by putting people on the couch. I have not yet run across a psychoanalytic psychotherapist that puts people on the couch. I'm sure they must be out there. I'm sure I will meet one someday, but I haven't found anybody yet. So that's just a cultural thing, right? It's a cultural thing. So while you're on the couch, you're just free associating. the therapist behind you, there's sort of this nebulous blank screen behind you, and that also helps you to be able to manifest a transference toward them. The transference, because you're not looking at them as a real person, the transference will be more what you're projecting on them and less who they really are, because you can't see them. Okay, so it actually helps us facilitate this sort of workable transference, which then the therapist, the analyst, will then reflect back to you through interpretation. Okay. Psychoanalysts also use the couch because this is what their training was. They were on the couch when they trained. So then that's sort of, I said the word, its use is baked into their character. Okay. It's a fixed point for the psychoanalyst. It's something that you do. It's a technique that is something that happens, every session. It's a fixed point because the rest of psychoanalysis is essentially improvisatory. It's improvisation. So this is the hard part about doing this kind of psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic psychotherapy, is that it is an improvisation. So if you know anything about music, classical musicians rarely improvise in their training. They don't learn to improvise. Even really, really good classical musicians are really bad at improvising. You'll find that out if you talk to any of them. And then you have like rock musicians who have a really, really simple structure to what they do, and they improvise all over the place, right? Rock music has sort of died now. So what is called rock music out there now, by the way, is really not rock music. Rock music has sort of almost died out. Pop music is just something that's created by AI, so I'm not even going to give that any credit. We're not even going to talk about that. And then you have jazz, and jazz is probably the best analogy to psychoanalysis, music psychoanalysis, because you have some structure, right? You have some baked in structure. The structure can be less complicated or more complicated, but you also have a lot of space for improvising. So if you think of like sort of really freeform jazz where there's lots of improvising, that's going to be psychoanalysis. Now, the improvisations will take on certain patterns because people will manifest, typically manifest kind of the same patterns. For instance, the Oedipal complex will be very typical, something you'll see all the time, right? And so your improvisations will be around that pattern, right? Just like saying, jazz musicians play a 2/6, 2/6/1 chord pattern, right? That's really common in jazz. And so, jazz musicians learn to improvise around that pattern. Well, you can say, psychoanalysts see lots of Oedipal issues coming up, and they see that all the time in the transference, and so they learn to improvise around that pattern. Very similar. Use a music analogy. I don't know if you guys know enough about music to get this make sense to you. Maybe not. I'm a musician, so it makes really good sense to me. But the idea is improvising, right? You think about it in terms of theater. You can think about theater, or comedians that improvise, right? There's some comedians that come out, everything is written down, they memorize it, they just do their jokes. Some comedians come out and just riff with the audience, right? And psychoanalysis is more like the riffing with the audience. It's improvising. Improvising is something that we as human beings in our educational system in general do not get a lot of practice doing. So this is something where I think if you have a background in music, you have a background in art, or you have a background in sort of improvisatory theater, this is going to help you to become a better therapist. Artists improvise a lot, right? Visual artists improvise a lot. So this is something, and I would say is development as part of your development as a therapist. You can take this with a big grain of salt, but part of your development as a therapist, I would highly encourage you to pick up a hobby or a practice or pick up an art form that allows you to improvise. Because even though you're improvising in a different way, the idea of being able to let loose enough of your sort of, how do I want to say this, cognitive tightness, you have to let loose some of that in order to improvise well, no matter what, whether it's music or art or theater or whatever, or doing therapy, you have to let loose a little bit. And practicing any kind of art form that has an improvisatory aspect to it will help you do that. So I would encourage you to think about that. something that also makes you a better, well-rounded person. Also, it can bring you lots of joy in your life. So also can help you to put your therapy switch in the off position and you go do your art. So that's just a little piece of advice. You can take that with a grain of salt, but I just think as a therapist, it's a really good thing. I know therapists who are musicians. I know therapists who do art. I know a lot of therapists who do art, have an art, do some kind of artwork. And it really seems to help them become better therapists. And being a therapist also, I think, influences their art quite a bit. And so you'll see this when you meet people, just like you meet a lot of physicians who are musicians. There are a lot of physicians who are actually classical musicians, pretty good classical musicians among the physicians, because they're doing, they're having to improvise all day long. So I think for them, it's like doing something where they don't have to improvise is nice for them. And but anyway, just a little thought for you guys to think about. Okay. So again, psychoanalysts use the couch. I told you about my psychotherapy. The only difference between it and a full-blown psychoanalysis was just the number of times I came every week, right? If I'd come, twice a week or 3 times a week, it would have been psychoanalysis. I came once a week, so it was psychotherapy. You can certainly do therapy that way. That's perfectly fine. I think I got a lot out of my therapy. On the other hand, if the therapist I was seeing was not a psychoanalyst, but was a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, I wouldn't have been on the couch, almost guaranteed. Okay. For psychoanalytic psychotherapists, using the couch is not part of their identity and rarely part of their training. Okay. Most people who do psychoanalytic psychotherapy, when they go through their own therapy, they sit in a chair. I'm a weird one that I went through psychoanalytic psychotherapy and used the couch. Who knows? Now, is there any reason why you couldn't use the couch? Absolutely not. There's no law saying as a therapist you can't use the couch. You can. And maybe we should. Maybe a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, maybe we should be, using the couch. Maybe we should infringe on those psychoanalysts. Who are they to not let us use the couch? Our patients deserve to lie down and be comfortable too, right? So maybe that's okay. So, if you decide to go into this, keep an open mind. I think it's perfectly okay. There's no stricture on it, but it's just the culture that it's not really done. Okay. Now, when I was a therapist in practice, I split the difference, right? I used chairs, but I used them in a couch-like way. In other words, when I had like a client, for instance, who had borderline personality disorder, I did this face to face because the client would see me. I could serve as a container to the client a little bit more. And container, I'll talk about when we talk about borderline personality disorder. I'll talk about Otto Kernberg and his idea of the therapy containing the person with the borderline personality disorder. And so face to face in the chair is a better way to do that. The person doesn't space out and start freaking out. By looking at you, they can sort of keep things together a little bit better. When I saw higher functioning patients who were sort of neurotic level or in between personality disorder, neurotic, what used to be called characterological, I would do this on the bottom. I would sit here and I would have the patient here. I would have the chair angled not toward me, but the patient could see me out of their periphery, but they were basically staring straight ahead. So they would get in a couch-like hypnagogic state and free associate more easily, but they weren't staring straight at me because these people could tolerate, that a lot better. And what I would also do is I would keep the room darker. I'd make the room a little darker, not dark, but, a little bit, the lighting would be very subdued. And that would also help this hypnagogic state. And I found that to be very, very successful. And I saw a lot of patients like that. I found that to be very, very successful. They could look at me if they needed to see me. They could look over and see that I was there. But at the same time, they could also get all the benefits of the couch, of being sort of in a, kind of a twilight thing. They could free associate more easily. The transference, came about more easily. And so I found this method to be very useful for me. I like this method. And this comes from a analyst, I mentioned this before, Ronald Fairburn, an English-British analyst who didn't like using the couch. He thought Freud only used the couch because he didn't like to be looked at, and he came up with this technique of using the chairs. And I really like this. I think this worked out really well for me. I thought this was really good. And this is Fairburn right here. Very interesting guy, by the way. Super interesting. I wrote a paper about him and used a lot of his work in my book on drug addiction. Super interesting guy, and this is what he wrote about the chair. You guys can read this. Okay. But he liked to do the chair thing. So I follow the Fairburnian version of the chair thing. And it's nice to be able to say I didn't come up with this, or I'm just doing this, but somebody actually in the psychoanalytic history came up with this to do this, right? So that you can always refer back to Fairburn if you want to be doing this. Okay. And again, as I mentioned, people with more severe issues, you might need to be face-to-face initially. Okay. And Otto Kernberg was the one who talked about this. And we'll talk more about Kernberg later. Talk a lot about Kernberg later. Okay. And again, I had a patient who had borderline personality disorder, and anytime she would become stressed in therapy or challenged, she would go have a psychotic break in the middle of the session. And the face-to-face was really beneficial in helping her keep together. If she had been facing away from me or on the couch, she would have just decompensated and probably had to have been taken to the hospital. So, again, you got to gauge where your patient is at on how you do this stuff. And one thing you can do is you can start out face-to-face, for the initial sessions, kind of get a sense, a diagnostic sense of where the patient is at, and then you can decide how you're going to angle the chairs. And you can even tell the patient, I'm angling the chair so you're not looking directly at me. This will help you to free associate, just to say whatever comes into your mind, without, my, looking at me interfering with that. So why don't we try this, and you can try it out and see how it works. Okay, personal items in the office. Generally, as psychoanalytic therapists, psychoanalytic clinicians, we do not keep a lot of things that relate to our personal lives in the office. Okay. This is things like family pictures and things like that. It's not just to protect confidentiality of your family, right? But also, you don't want to interfere with the patient's developing fantasies about the therapy, because this relates to the transference, right? And so if they know that you're married, or they know that you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or they know that you've got kids, that will sort of interfere, or that will direct their fantasies about you. And you don't want to do that. You want their fantasies to come mostly from them, not from what they're getting from you. And so again, you don't want a lot of your own personal stuff in the office. Now, my dad writes, he has a very good textbook on psychoanalytic treatment that by the way, he has told me that if you guys want a copy of this, a PDF copy, I'm more than happy to give you a copy of this book. He said I could give it out to you guys. And it's a really good book, really interesting. And he really talks about psychoanalysis in that book, not psychoanalytic therapy. But he talks about a psychoanalyst he supervised who in his office had an antique sword on the wall next to the couch. And my dad didn't know about the sword being there, but he later on he learned about it when the analyst patient had castration anxiety. He was having difficulty working through his problems lying on the couch and looking at the sword above him. Now, you could also ask what was going on in the therapist's mind if they would put a sword above their couch. And if I was supervising this guy and found out, we would be having some sessions about that. And again, remember I mentioned to you that sometimes your supervisor also can function as a therapist. This is a case where the supervisor should be pointing out, interpreting what's going on with having a sword. Why do you feel the need to have that above the couch? And I never asked my dad about I should ask him if he ever, what he thought about what's going on in the therapist's mind, right? But eventually my dad told him to get rid of it, and he got rid of it, and the guy was able to work through the stuff. So again, you see that. One thing that we've noticed over the years is that a lot of patients will become very interested in plants in your office. This is kind of a weird thing. You have potted plants. They'll, especially patients that have mother issues, will become very preoccupied with the plants in your office and whether you're taking care of them or not. And so I wouldn't say necessarily you would want to not have plants in your office, but if you do have them in there, and you start to get the patient becoming preoccupied with how you're taking care of them, the plants die or whatever, you might be wondering if there's something that they had some sort of, deprivation of motherly love in their life. Now that's something that's very interesting. So it points out that anything in your office can become part of the therapy. Again, the office is a tool, so anything in the office can become part of the therapy. And that, again, that's why you don't want to put a lot of your own personal stuff in there. Freud liked to put a lot of he had a lot of antiquities in his office, like statues and things like that. He was a collector, sort of amateur archaeologist. A lot of therapists like to put up artwork that's sort of abstract, that doesn't have like a direct meaning, but sort of abstract art that you can project onto, almost like a Rorschach test on the wall. My analyst had this painting, this black blob of a painting on the wall in front of the couch. It's like, like weird abstract stuff you could just sort of project onto it. I had all sorts of weird projections onto it. So anything in the office can become a tool. So the plants can become something that become part of the therapy. Just be aware, anything in the office can become part of the therapy. The color of the chairs, the type of chairs, the lighting, the temperature, any of that stuff can become part of the therapy. And if it comes up, you don't ignore it. You work through it. If the patient's commenting on the fact that one of your plants died, you have to say, I'm just curious, what that might, what you feel about that plant being dead. You talked about it a couple of times, and what I'm just wondering what you're thinking about that. You bring it into the therapy. So anything in the office comes into therapy. So again, that's why you keep your personal junk out of the office. And you will see, if you go to, we could go into Camarillo, we could find 20 counselors and go into their office, and I'll guarantee you I bet you almost money, you will see family pictures in every single one of them. Okay. None of those people are psychoanalytic psychotherapists. Okay. If you must have a thick picture of your family in your office, expect it's going to become part of your therapy. You're going to be analyzing what's going on, and the transference is going to be, into some degree, it's going to be contaminated. Okay. If it's contaminated, you still work through it. You still got to work through it, but you got to realize it's going to contaminate it. So again, you want to keep the transference as pure as possible, purely on the patient's fantasies as much as possible, and less, in whatever's going on in your real life. Okay. And so my dad has a thing here. Another case, one of his cases. I don't know, maybe this was my case. Patient who's dealing with a lack of motherly love and how she's struggling to develop a stable narcissistic personality, to deny not having a good enough mother. She described how she surround herself with the best paintings, the fantastic dinner plates. Everything was the best, the most fantastic. During the first session, the patient noted her counter response. We're going to talk about counter response in a minute as something different than counter transference. That the therapist thought that this new patient wouldn't find her office as not a good enough place because there was a stain on the carpet, right? And in fact, this patient Natalie came in and noticed the spot in the therapist's office and brought it up. Okay. And so the idea is that, this became part of the therapy. The therapist got in supervision, the therapist was able to understand that the patient externalized her love, her hunger for love in her childhood onto this black spot, right? But the therapist, because they were worried that this was going to make something in the office, the therapist had the spot removed, right? Because it was bad or dirty, right? And so the patient then was affected by that, right? So again, don't make big changes in your office. You keep the office the same. You don't make changes. So if you've got a spot on the carpet, don't suddenly go and clean it, because maybe the patient has some projection, especially if the patient's been talking about that. So you don't want to make any big changes in your office. You don't want to make big changes in the furniture. You don't want to make big changes in the decor, things. You don't want to, oh, I decided I'm going to I want to go, early modern, I just redid everything, no. The patient has to practice abstinence in therapy. We're going to talk about that next. The therapist also in the therapy office needs to practice a form of abstinence. In other words, not changing things. Okay. So that's also important. Now, you guys are going to be working in a lot of clinics and, agencies and things like that. You're not going to have control over the office stuff. So just realize that is going to be something that some of the stuff is going to come up. The office is still your tool, even though you're not in charge of it, and then people may make changes in it, clean up the black spots, whatever. The office is still your tool. Just be aware that stuff may come up around that. Okay. That makes sense to everybody? Anybody have any experience like this, where stuff in the office became something that the patient became interested in? Anybody had any kind of experience with that? So again, this is also something that will happen more in longer term therapy than short term therapy, but it can happen in short term therapy, especially if you get somebody with a personality disorder coming in. They will notice stuff like in the third session that something in the office changed. You'll see that.
I don't know if this counts, but previously I used to bring my dog in with me every day, and with kid patients, it happened a few times where they would tell me everything the dog was feeling, and it really aligned with the things that I think they were feeling. Like they'd invent like big backstories for the dog, and then if I asked like, is that happening for you? They'd be like, oh yeah, like I guess it is, but they had just like totally projected it.
Yeah, there's a lot of research on animal assisted therapy now, and most of it is very positive. I actually think you could work in having a dog in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. I think, or a therapy animal. I actually think that would be something really interesting. I don't know that's done a lot in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, but I could see trying it out. I could see it could be very beneficial, especially with kids, as you say. Also, kids, there is a psychoanalytic play therapy, right? A lot of the Jungian psychoanalytic people do play therapy. And that is a similar kind of function. The dolls are doing these things, they're playing with the toys, and you ask the kids, what's going on in the toy? Is that anything like your life? Similar kind of thing that you're describing. Dogs, however, can elicit a certain kind of a transference. And so, I could see where that could be very, very useful. On the other hand, what you don't want to do, you don't want the dog to dilute the transference with you, the therapist. So that's where you'd have to sort of work that out a little bit. I mean, that would be a wonderful dissertation if somebody wanted to look at psychoanalytic therapy and animal therapy together. The research on animal therapy is very positive, by the way. I'm wondering if it would just make me more comfortable as the therapist to have the dog in the office with me. I mean, I'd love to have my dogs in the office with me, On the other hand, my dogs are really, really dumb. They are just the dumbest creatures. They're really sweet, but they're just dumb. Maybe that would be good. I don't know. It'd be interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. Huh. Maybe next time I talk to Dan, I'll ask Dan about it. If somebody's getting supervised from Dan, ask him what he thinks about animal assisted therapy. I'd be curious about that. Next time I see him, I'm going to ask him about that, because that'd be a good question for him. Because I have students in my other doctoral class at Pacifica. I have one student who's actually an animal behaviorist. She's trained in animal behavior, and she's worked a lot with dogs, and I think has done a lot of animal therapy. I'll ask her as well how she uses the animals in therapy. But I think it could be done. It'd be interesting to try that, especially with kids. I think it'd be great. With adults, I don't know. I have to think about that. That's really interesting. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. That's actually a really good, interesting idea. If I do a second edition of the book, I should probably add that in there. So good. Yes.
Maybe incorporate equine therapy as well.
Equine therapy as well. Yeah. Going out and riding horses and doing everything like that. Yeah. Equine therapy and therapy out of the office therapy is interesting. There was a very famous Jungian analyst who was actually the supervisor of one of my teachers, who liked to take his patients for walks. Patient would show up for the therapy hour, and then we'd go walk around the city for an hour. And you can imagine the benefits of this. the benefits, you get exercise, which we know cures depression as well as or better than drugs and psychotherapy, right? There's exercise, and the therapist gets exercise, and the person is able to, they can still develop a transference with the therapist, and they're able to like be actually out in the real world, and the therapist can see how they're interacting with the real world. So this guy was very known for doing this, walking with the patients. And Freud, I think also actually, I know Freud took walks with his colleagues, some of whom he was doing analysis with. But I know Freud may have done it too. I'll have to look that up. But I think that's a whole other thing, like being outside. So the horses would be part of that. You're outside, you're doing something, I mean, I want to do dirt bike riding therapy. That's what I'd like to do, take people out and teach them to ride a dirt bike, because that's like the funnest thing in the entire world. And, and then like, that's going to be open up people, so there's a whole idea. What do you do you doing things with people in the outside world, right? That could be a whole nother branch of psychoanalytic therapy that probably hasn't been really well explored. Psychoanalytic therapists, psychoanalysts tend to be fairly conservative in that this is how we've done things for the last 100 years. We probably just keep doing them the way we're doing them. But the idea of expanding out, that's maybe your guys' generation maybe you'll be the ones to be thinking about doing that. I think that's kind of an interesting idea. So good. Yeah, good. These are really good ideas. I like this. Okay. All right. So, and Freud had dogs too, by the way. So Freud had his chows. I don't know that they were in his, I think actually they were sometimes in his therapy sessions. Now that I'm thinking about it, Freud kept chows. I had a chow. I love my chow. She was so sweet. I miss her dearly. Not nearly as dumb as the dogs I have now. But yeah, I mean, there's, so everything, and this is Freud's office here. You can go to, if you go to Vienna, you can go to Freud's house, and they've turned it into a museum, and you can see this stuff. Also, if you go to England, when Freud was in England the last year and a half of his life, they've turned his house in England in Hampstead into a museum. And I haven't been to the one in Vienna, but I have been to the one in Hampstead, and it's really, really cool. I mean, you get to go there and see where he lived, and it's really, really neat. So I would recommend that. When you come in the psychotherapeutic environment, if you might do diagnostic interviews, you might use some personality assessment instruments. So you're going to learn some stuff from Dan, and you decide whether you're going to do analysis or psychotherapy. And then you want to inform the new patient how the therapy sessions will be conducted. You basically tell them that the main rule is to say whatever comes to their mind, and therapists will talk whenever I think it will be useful. And the instructions are pretty simple. Remember, this is an improvisatory thing, right? It's not a manualized, even though there are manualized versions of this kind of therapy now, transference focused and mineralization based, that they're more manualized. But this is the full-on. Now I've got Bill Evans on the piano, I've got Dave Holland on the bass, I got John McLaughlin on guitar, I got Charlie Parker on the horn. Now we're going to put the jazz trios put together. We're now going to improvise, right? So this is really you're setting up the improvisatory process, right? Carl Mininger is a very famous psychoanalyst who wrote a lot of books on psychoanalysis. Wrote that you shouldn't be promising a cure or even relief. You're only going to try to promise. You tell the patient you're just going to try to help them by a method that's helped others, and something that will hopefully help the patient be able to help themselves. Okay, and I think that's an important thing to be thinking about when you talk to the patient. You don't want to overpromise things, right? You don't want to set up expectations in a way. Okay, so it's a reality-based collaboration between the therapist and the patient. And again, this includes, trust and ethics, and this is part of the therapeutic alliance that will develop, right? And you want to develop that therapeutic alliance. You want to start that going, ASAP. Okay. And again, in psychoanalysis, typical for the patient to have 4 to 5 sessions a week. It's usually, unless you're seeing people who have a lot of money. That's really not possible here unless you're going to an analytic institute. Maybe you can get somebody who's in training and you can see them for less. But For psychoanalytic psychotherapists, you try to do twice a week. That's usually not even possible. Usually, so typically it's once a week. Most of my patients I saw them once a week. Okay, and that's fine. Or you can see them, as I did, patients. You see them once a week in individual therapy and once a week in group therapy, which I highly recommend. I think that was a really good model to use, especially with higher functioning patients, more neurotic level patients. That was a really good system. See them once a week individual and once a week in group therapy. Okay, but whatever combination works there. And you don't change what you do depending on how many days a week you see them. It's still the same improvisatory process. As you guys know, typically people come in to see a psychotherapist. They come in seeking symptom relief, and they want to, they only want to come in for a certain number of sessions, or their insurance will only pay for a couple sessions. And in this case, you would probably employ non-psychoanalytic techniques. Somebody can only come in for 3 sessions. You probably want to do something else, right? I'm trained in, I did some training in humanistic therapy, which is a little more short term. I might do that, or maybe I would probably, if I was in practice, go out and learn CBT, right? I would do some CBT, and then if the person wanted to go on, they were interested in, they thought this is a really good process. They might do better in doing some long-term therapy. Then I would offer them the opportunity to switch into a psychoanalytic mode and explain to them the difference between that. And I think that's perfectly good. I do think this sort of integrated model where you do something for very short-term therapy, for symptom relief, and then having the possibility to transition that into more long-term therapy to get at underlying stuff. I think that's going to become more of the model. I think you're going to see more and more people, especially your guys' generation, especially when you're not so attached to being in a certain tribe, right? That you can switch. You can do what's useful. As Bruce Lee, the martial artist, said, take what is useful. So, you only have 3 sessions, do CBT with the person, right? Then if they want to stay on, do more long-term, do 2 years of therapy, then switch to psychoanalytic therapy, right? There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing inherently wrong with doing both. And there's nothing wrong, or there's nothing to prevent people from developing the tool set to do multiple different kinds of things. And so I think this integrative type of therapy is really going to be the thing we're going to be seeing in the future. We're already seeing a number of books coming out now integrating mostly CBT with psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And so other people are working on this. This is becoming a thing now. You can do this purely from a psychoanalytic psychotherapy point of view. There's a number of books, techniques out there for doing short-term psychoanalytic psychotherapy. It looks a lot like CBT to me. It's very similar, but the psychoanalytic person would say they're doing ego psychology stuff. They're bolstering ego, helping a person with their defenses, things like that. You can do it purely, but the idea that we're going to be able to pick what's useful for the person for when they need it, I think that's a good thing. So I think these integrated models are something I would encourage you guys to be open-minded to, Okay. What else? So again, you'll talk about frequency of sessions, and then we'll take a break as soon as we're done with this thing here. Frequency of sessions. And again, a lot of integrated approaches now being tried. And I put in some references for you guys to look at this. So integrating CBT and psychodynamic therapy, a lot of references, a lot of stuff being written about this now. So you can see this is probably going to happen. Okay. You got to tell the patient to keep their appointments. Okay. If they miss an appointment for some reason, that's going to be grist for the mill. Okay. Payment for sessions, practical things. You have to explain that, they're going to be charged for missing payments or missing hours. If they miss a session, they're going to be charged for it. There are old school ways of doing this and sort of newer ways of doing this. The old school way of doing it is you charge the patient for every session. Even the analysts back in the days when they took vacation, and back in the day on the East Coast, everybody on the East Coast takes their vacation in August, right? They take 2 weeks in August, typical. Old school psychoanalysts will charge the patients for the weeks they take vacation, because the idea is that they're charging for the session. They're charging the person because they reserve those sessions for that person. So that's the old school analyst. I think most analysts and psychoanalytic therapists now don't do that. You don't charge people for your vacations, but it used to be. You do charge for missed sessions. You will discuss why the person missed the session. You will go into that. You will interpret what's going on in that. You'll interpret that as a resistance. A lot of times that is a resistance. You have to be very careful how you do that, especially in the beginning, because otherwise you're going to lose your patient. So you want to get that therapeutic alliance sort of established, and then start interpreting resistance about things. Something came up hard in the last session. I'm wondering if you missed this, you weren't here last time. I wonder if that was partially due to, maybe we talked about something that was really tough in the previous session. I know your car broke down, but I wonder if there was something in the previous session that was like, especially difficult for you. Say something like that, right? You have to pay attention to unconscious symbolic meaning and acting out related to payment. So money is a big thing. You'll see all sorts of stuff spring up about money. When I was doing my training, the analyst I trained with, Luca, he made me, this was really hard. He made me have the patient pay every session. This is the old school, real old school training, right? Pay every session. So at the end of the session, my clients would have to write a check. Back in the day when people wrote checks, they would have to write a check or pay me cash. Mostly they wrote a check. They had to write a check. And man, stuff would come up out of that. Patient would write me a check. You could see how pissed off they were getting. Next session, I noticed when you wrote the check last week that you seemed like you were getting upset, like the whole session just on that. I mean, money brings up all sorts of stuff for people. And, we typically in our society, we keep money stuff hidden from each other. So we have a lot of unconscious stuff around, and ourselves, we have a lot of unconscious stuff around money. And so the reason that Luca did that when he was supervising me was because he really wanted me to see about all the unconscious stuff about money. And man, it really came out. Now, the reality of it is when you're in practice, it's not practical to take a check every session. Okay. It becomes difficult. And so what you end up doing is you do what everybody does. You bill people once a month, right? Again, you still will get grist for the mill billing people once a month, right? And sending them a bill and having them send to you. And then the bills don't show up on time. People don't pay their bills. All sorts of stuff comes up, and then you get to talk about that. But doing it, I would recommend, if you ever get a chance to have the experience of having somebody pay in the session, at the end of the session, don't go out and pay the agency or the secretary, but write the check, swipe the credit card, put the cash on the table right in front of you. It really gives a whole dimension to doing therapy. Completely, you'll get a whole nother level of, oh my God, there's some stuff going on unconsciously here. Okay. Yes,
And specifically making the payment at the end of session rather than the beginning.
Yeah. I always did it. I was told to do it at the end. I don't know. I mean, maybe you could do it in the beginning. I had one woman that I supervised. She was an MFT, and had a big practice. Actually, was at the time way more experienced than me, but I was her supervisor for psychology, our first her psychology license, and I was her dissertation supervisor and her clinical supervisor. And she had a very large practice. And she was the first therapist I ever saw who had the patient swipe a credit card. She had a credit card reader in her office. This is way back in the day, first one I'd ever seen. And the patients would come in the office and she would swipe the credit card. She would do it in the beginning of the session. I didn't think it was, not as much stuff came in. And also because the credit card's a little more removed, you don't see the bill till later. So it's easy just to swipe, So, but nowadays, probably what you would do is at the end of the session, you have one of those little square things on your phone, and you would swipe the credit card. I would say, in my opinion, I would do it at the end. I think more stuff comes up at the end, but that's probably debatable. You could try it both ways and do an experiment and see what happens, but I would be consistent with one patient. If you do it with one patient and you do it at the end, always do it at the end. Or if you do it at the beginning, always do it at the beginning. But stuff comes up around money, and again, people, money is a really good, talk about mining for gold. Money is really, bring up a lot of issues in therapy. So again, something to pay attention to. Okay. If you work for an agency or a hospital setting, you can't do this as much. You don't get as much of that stuff. But if you get a chance, especially if you're in your own private practice, stuff will come up around money. Very typical. I mean, when I was a patient, I did all sorts of unconscious stuff. I forgot to pay bills and things like that. You didn't pay your bill this month. Oh, like why? Oh, I have a whole session just on that, right? And all sorts of stuff. Shame. There was an old psychoanalyst back in the day about money being equivalent to shit. There's all this stuff. Just all this stuff would come up. It's treasure trove. For the therapist. Okay? So pay attention to money. Okay. And again, around transfer, and also will relate to transference, the money is like, withholding, that they become a 2-year-old kid refusing to go to the bathroom, refusing to, to poop in the bathroom. The money is the poop. Oh my God, it would came up in I'm a therapist. In my therapy, it came up, and I should know stuff. I'm pretty aware of things. Came up in my therapy, and you see it all the time. It's really interesting, especially anal stage stuff. Really, money comes up. Fascinating. So a lot of really interesting things come up around money. Okay. All right. Okay, good. So let's take a break. Let's take a 15-minute break. It's 10:42:43. Let's meet back in 10:15. Let's meet back at 10:58. Is that 15 minutes? That's 15 minutes. A minute. 1, 2.
The time right now is 10:34.
10. Oh, right. My watch is fast. Okay, let's meet back at 10:45. Is that right? That 15 minutes?
At 10 minutes, so 10:50 might be.
10:50. Let's meet back at 10:50. Okay, I'm going to pause this too. If I can do that and unshare the screen, and we'll go to the next lecture. Okay. Any questions on anything before we pause? Anything? Okay, take a break, come back, ask me. Ready back? Okay, I'm going to put the new slide.
Yeah, we're back.
Okay, good. Good. I'm just sitting here talking to Hannah and BSing here. Okay, so let me get rid of some of these things. We talked about this one. Let me get rid of this. Let me get rid of this. Okay, so now we're going to talk about neutrality. And I just have to find it here. Neutrality and transference and countertransference. So this is probably the most important thing that I can talk to you about in the whole course. Okay, can you guys see that? That visible to you?
Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, great. Okay, so neutrality, countertransference, and what is the last thing on here? That's and counter response. Counter response, most people don't talk about. So this may be the only time you ever hear about counter response, but I think it's important to talk about. So we'll start with transference. I've already sort of alluded to this already. Transference is the displacement or projection of a pattern of relationship, including attitudes, feelings, thoughts, etc., originally experienced in early childhood relationships to other people, which are termed, the term of art is objects in a person's adult life. Okay. So in your early childhood, the objects are your mother, your father, your siblings. You could be multiple mothering people, some cultures. Those are people, outside of the infant's world, right? Those are what we call those objects. So that's a term that you should memorize. You should know what that means. When we say object relations, we mean relationships to other people in the infant's world. In transference, these early relationships are re-experienced with significant persons, usually caregivers or parental figures from early childhood. And you will sorry, this isn't worded very well. You will re-experience these relationships from caregivers in early childhood with other people in your life as adults. Okay. Transference colors almost all human relationships to some degree, but transference heavy relationships can become problematic or pathological. So this is the idea again. Think of this as you're learning how to be in relationship with other people, starting with your mothering person, and then we'll go to the father and then the siblings, and that's the patterns. The way you relate to other people is established with those early people, and then you will then that way of relating will then be modified as you go through different developmental levels, right? The developmentals will modify that. And hopefully by the time you get through your developmental levels successfully, you've now have a mature, constructive, useful way of relating to other people. Okay. And probably again, from as an evolutionary psychologist, I'll say this pattern of going through these developmental stages and modifying these early patterns of relationship probably had survival value, probably allowed us to live in groups and to be successful hunters and to have more evolutionary fitness, right? Had survival value. So that's probably where it comes from. Okay. But we tend to have transference almost in every relationship that we have, you know. So I'm the professor in your class, you're all the students. And so to some degree, you know, you will probably have some kind of father transference onto me, right? Because I'm older, you know, I'm the father figure here. And so you'll have some kind of father transference. I try to minimize that. I would rather you have a transference like older brother, younger sibling transference. I prefer that. That's a Taoist idea. I think I mentioned that to you guys before. But some kind of transference will be there. I will have transference to you guys, probably more like, you know, more like I would have transference to, you know, my kid or somebody like that, just because you're younger. I try to fight against that. I try to be aware of that and treat you like colleagues. Again, maybe more like younger siblings. That's my preferential. The father-kid transference thing is, yeah, not so good, you know, because it brings up all sorts of authoritarian issues. And then if I become the authoritarian in the class, you project that onto me. I had the counter transference that I then become the authoritarian figure. And I start saying, well, you have to show up to class, you know, you can't be 5 minutes late. Then we develop this pattern. And then I think that gets in the way of learning. And so I prefer not to do that. And so I try to be aware of that. But since I've been through therapy, knock on wood, I'm aware of some of these things. I'm aware of especially authoritarian stuff that I had with my parents. And so I try not to replay that out as much as I can. I have some awareness of it, right? And that's the idea. So that's the idea of what you get out of therapy is you realize, one of the things you get out of therapy is you realize when the relationships that you are manifesting are transference heavy. And then you can be aware of that and go, I do not have to treat this person as if she were my mother and I was 2 years old. Great. I can do something else, right? I have a choice, right? So that's one of the benefits of therapy is to not have a choice of acting out of transference or choosing the kind of transference that you would like to manifest, the kind of relationship you want to manifest. Okay. It used to be thought that people with severe mental illnesses, personality disorders, and psychosis do not form transferential relationships, or the transferential relationships are so messed up that you really can't use the transference in therapy. And we know this isn't true now. And you will read about that in our book. And also in the schizophrenia book that I wrote before this one, you can develop transference relationships with people with schizophrenia even. You just have to be able to symbolically understand what's going on with them, which most people do not. And so again, that's what we wrote about in the schizophrenia book. And there's plenty of books around now. Especially, you know, I recommend a lot Otto Kernberg's book, where he'll talk about transferential relationships with people with personality disorders. The transference with personality disorders, however, is more difficult to work with because of the splitting defenses and the dissociation. So it's tougher, but you can have a transferential relationship, as well as narcissistic people. You can develop a transferential relationship. They have this certain characteristic to it that you've got to like know how to deal with, but you can work with those, and you can work with them very successfully. Okay, so we've now extended psychoanalytic therapy to all levels of pathology. Okay. Transference relationships are unconscious; they're repetitive. They recur all the time without a person coming aware of it. Somebody comes in to see you, for instance, because they just can't seem to hold down a job, and you talk to them for a few sessions, and you find out they always have some problem with their boss. They always, their boss is always, an authoritarian asshole and always telling them what to do, and they end up blowing up and screaming at their boss and getting fired. You can suspect that there's a transference going on here that the person is unaware of, and they're repeating it over and over and over again. And so the goal of therapy, one of the goals will be to make that transference conscious. And how are you going to do that? Because that transference this person has with their boss, they're now going to have with you. And the idea is you as therapist is not to react to that, have a counter transference, but to interpret, to remain neutral and interpret that to somebody. It's interesting how you are, you think that I'm going to tell you what to do, start making interpretations about that. So help the person become aware of what's going on. So that's a very typical scenario, by the way. That's something you will see in therapy. People coming in, you can't keep a job, and this is because they have trouble with authority figures. Very, very common. Very, very common. You will see that, and that is usually almost always a transference issue. Almost always related to that kind of transference issue will be an Oedipal. If the person's kind of a neurotic level personality organization, will be an Oedipal issue. Very, very common. Very, very, very common. You'll see that. I would guarantee you, probably some of you are already seeing that. Very, very common kind of a thing. Okay. One thing you have to assess is the patient's personality organization. We're going to talk about in detail about personality organization a bit later, because this is what's going to tell you, this is how you're going to tell somebody who's personality disordered versus somebody who's neurotic or somebody who's psychotic. It's by examining their personality organization. So we're going to go into a lot of detail about that. But just so you know, the personality organization will determine the type of transference that will manifest in psychotherapy. And in fact, by understanding or perceiving the type of transference will cue you into whether or not what personality level the person's at, what kind of personality organization they have. So that's very important. Okay, that's very important. We're going to talk about that in much more detail a little bit later, about the organization a little bit later. Okay, patients develop a transference neurosis, and this can be a borderline transference, a narcissistic transference, a psychotic transference, or a neurotic transference. Neurotic meaning relatively normal level. Borderline is going to have, the characteristics of splitting and dissociation. Narcissistic is going to have the characteristics of the person developing this grandiose sense of self that's got to be fed all the time. And psychotic transference is going to have a sense of a lot of fragmentation. Okay. And so in all cases, you want to resolve the transferences. But as you resolve these transferences, like I say, you have a schizophrenic patient, you do therapy with them, they resolve the schizophrenic transference, they're now going to have a borderline transference. They're going to resolve the borderline transference. Now they're going to have a neurotic transference. So the transference, as the person gets better, as their personality organization normalizes, they will go through the different levels of transference, and they'll go through the different levels of personality organization. They'll have different kinds of transference, and if you're doing especially psychoanalysis with somebody, you will see that happening. Okay. In psychotherapy, transference relationships always occur with the psychotherapist, regardless of the type of psychotherapy. So this is a little bit of a controversial statement, because what I'm telling you is that even though you're doing CBT with somebody, there's still a transference going on. The patient still has a transference towards you. And you will notice this. I've had students from CLU come and tell me, I really don't understand. I was seeing this patient. We had such a great relationship. She really seemed to like me. We were doing so well. I was doing CBT with her, and she was, learning to, get rid of her maladaptive thoughts and think better thoughts, and everything was going. And then she came in the next session, and she just was just hating on me and just was railing. And then she didn't come back after that. I have no idea what went on. Well, that's because you're not aware of the transference. You didn't pay attention to the transference stuff. And so, that kind of thing happens all the time in therapies that don't work with the transference. And, sometimes the therapies work with the transference without the therapist realizing that's what they're doing. And a lot of the humanistic therapies do that. Sometimes they don't work with the transference at all, right? There's lots of therapies that don't deal with transference at all. except in maybe an abstract way. So behavioral therapy, you know, there's transference that goes on. I would speculate that some of the reinforcement that the therapist gives the patient is going to be related to the transference, that there'll be a transference developing based on what's reinforced to some degree. But is that a play of an early childhood relationship? Probably it's there. Probably it's there, because that early child was reinforced for certain things, right? And so that child that's now an adult will have an expectation that certain things are going to be reinforced. And so that comes into the transference relationship. So again, it's one of these things where I really think it's psychoanalytic people ought to learn a little bit about behaviorism, and behaviorists should learn a little bit about psychoanalysis, because this is a really good place where the two things really come together, right? That, you know, one way of looking at transference is what were you reinforced for as a small child, right? And what are those of those early childhood things that you were behaviors that you were reinforced for? What are those? Which of those still exist in you as an adult and are maladaptive as an adult, right? So I think that's a way you can look at transference from a behavioral point of view. I think it's actually very helpful. Yes, Anna.
I was thinking of how in like ACT will ask them like, who taught you that rule, who taught you that, and how well was that working for you?
Yeah.
As like a reflective of maybe from back when you're learning history, that's how it's happened.
Yeah.
And then but look at it now, like present moment, does that still work? Is it still
yeah. It's a good example. The difference is in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, those things are unconscious. So the person would not have direct access to it. So that's what the free association is for. You start seeing the patterns, and then you have to say, I wonder when you were a child if, you know, you were reinforced for, you know, doing this with mommy or something, you know, because it's going to be unconscious. They're not going to be able to directly access it. You're not gonna be able to say, oh, what was it that you learned as a child? Oh, I learned this and that. But the thing that's hidden is the thing you really want to get to, right? It's the hidden stuff. So that's the difference, right? That's the difference. So if you're dealing with symptom stuff, you're treating the person for the symptoms, you want to get to the symptoms, that kind of thing is really good. What did you learn? You know, what are the thoughts you're having? Because you only have a few sessions, you want to deal with the symptoms, that's the way you want to do it. The long-term stuff, what you want to do is you want to get to the hidden stuff, and you can't get at that directly. You can't say, what's in your unconscious? Tell me what's in your unconscious. Most of us can't do that, right? I mean, maybe psychedelic assisted psychotherapy will allow that. I don't know. That's another dissertation topic somebody could be doing. Maybe if you're on mushrooms and you're in the therapy session and somebody says, well, what's going on in your unconscious? They might be able to tell you because all the inhibitions have been released or whatever. But they also might start confabulating things, which also you don't want. So you really want to get that hidden thing. So that's the difference between this kind of therapy, is the stuff is actually hidden. You can't get at it directly by just asking about it. Okay. You can interpret stuff in patterns that you see, and then the person, some of that stuff will bubble up, and then maybe the hidden thing will come to consciousness. But it usually takes a while. Can't just get at it directly. Okay. But there's yes, go ahead, Raquel.
Thank you. I'm wondering, because the thing that keeps like coming up in the back of my head, and this is not to be argumentative, it's just like a curiosity.
Please.
Is you know, there's a lot of research on kind of like implanted memories, and like memory being kind of like, you know, not necessarily like consistent. How do you, when you're doing like a free association and you're trying to help somebody tap their unconscious, how do you find that balance between helping somebody label it and labeling it for them?
Ah, very, very good question. Excellent question. You do not label it for them. That's the simple answer. Now, in practice, that's a little harder to, the reality is. But what you want them to do is you want them to label it. You want them to come to the realization of, oh, this is what went on, not you telling them what went on. So again, telling them what, so there are versions of psychoanalytic therapy where people will be more directive, telling them what went on, right? The extreme versions of this would be, for instance, like Gestalt therapy, which is, Fritz Perls was a psychoanalyst, but he decided he was just going to be directed. So that he'll see a pattern, like an early childhood pattern. He'll just tell the person, this is what is going on, right? That's in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, you don't want to do that. You want it to organically, the person to have the realization of it. Likewise with the memory. So somebody may come up with a memory. You don't know whether that's a false memory. In psychoanalysis, we wouldn't call it a false memory. We call it a screen memory. In other words, it's a memory that's been edited to be more palatable to your conscious mind. So that's a screening something else that's underneath it, right? So the screen memory comes up, the memory comes up. We don't take that as a psychoanalytic therapist. We don't take that as the gospel truth of what's going on. We just say that's the working thing that we're working with right now. Let's keep, you'll get a sense as the therapist, there's something else going on besides just underneath this memory. So you'll just keep letting the person free associate. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about it. Other stuff will start bubbling up, and then they'll start remembering. Other stuff will start coming up. The actual memory will come up, and you'll see that happen. If you work with somebody long enough, you'll see that happen. We don't implant memories. We neither validate nor disvalidate the memories that come up. We always, especially if the memory seems a little bit too wrapped up like a gift with a bow on it, we are very skeptical of that, right? And me especially, because that's something I did with my analyst. I would give her, I told you about my shit dreams. I would give her these wrapped up gifts, right? I had memories of something that'd be a wrapped up gift because unconsciously I was thinking that's what she wanted to hear, right? I'm going to give her this gift. And so if I give her what she wants to hear, she won't probe deeper and I won't have to deal with the things that really are bothering me, right? I can keep those hidden, right? But she was a very good analyst. She didn't buy that, right? And she would interpret to me. It's like getting hit over the head with a hammer. Wow, oh, you're just trying to please me, and I'd have to get into something deeper. I wonder why you have a need to please me, like to make me like you. Oh my God, it would get into, it's like crap. Like now I got to get into the real shit, literally the real shit, that's so you develop a sixth sense for that. And that's also something why it's good to get some supervision, because you can get, people can give you screen memories and everything. So we always think of the memories sort of as a working hypothesis, not as a conclusion. That's how I would say it. A working hypothesis, not as a conclusion. You'll sense the authenticity. When you get enough experience, you'll sense the authenticity of the real things going on. The other thing is we don't really care about what the memory is. We don't really care about the actual thing that happened. What we really care about is the pattern that underlies the thing that happened. Because if that thing happened in one time, probably the pattern happened a lot more often. And maybe you didn't remember the instance when the pattern was happening, but it was happening all the time. And so we're really interested in getting the person aware of the pattern. And then when they become aware of the pattern, they start remembering times when that pattern manifested. But even more important, they start seeing how that pattern is manifesting out in their life now, starting with the relationship with the therapist. But once they realize it with the relationship with the therapist, they start realizing how they're doing it everywhere else in their life, with other people in their life. And that's what we call progress. That's a really good sign in therapy when the person starts realizing. And of course, we have more than one pattern, but they start realizing the patterns, how they're manifesting in the room, in the here and now. That's the really sine qua non, not the memory. The memory can be cathartic. That's great. I talked to you guys about catharsis. It's great. You can have the cathartic thing, the memory, it can be something heavy. I was abused as a child. I remember the abuse now, heavy catharsis. But that established a sort of pattern of relationship. How is that now manifesting in your life now? How's it manifesting in the therapy hour, in the here and now? That's where we really want to get to. That's what we really care about, not the memories per se so much. Okay? And we definitely don't want to be implanting memories and suggesting things. Oh, do you think that you might have been abused? Do you think that this might have happened to you? Not in psychoanalytic therapy. At least not in my training.
I imagine that pairs well with what you were mentioning, like near the beginning, and maybe I'm mixing up yours and Dr. Schwartz's class, but very both psychodynamic. So I'm trying to remember like where I heard it, but there was somebody who mentioned that a big part of it is trying to keep us neutral, like neutrality
Yes.
is possible.
Yeah, we're going to
And
talk about that in just a second.
yeah, I
Super
imagine that
important.
result of that.
Yeah, neutrality is super important. The main thing in which everything in the therapy hour pivots around, and it's very misunderstood. So, and there are different takes on it. I'm going to give you my take on it, which I think is sort of the golden median, right? But it's really important, because without that, if you don't have that, then whatever the patient's, whatever transference they're putting on you, you won't be able to see it clearly because your own stuff is in the way, right? So the neutrality is really, really important. But it's also not being a cold, aloof, distant, dissociated therapist, right? So there's also, you also have to make a connection in a therapeutic alliance with the person at the same time. We're going to talk about that in just a minute, so we'll get to that. Okay, so I will make the statement transference always occurs with a psychotherapist. I'll make the other statement that transference probably is occurring with everybody else in your life to some degree. And, you know, again, that's something that going through psychoanalytic therapy will help you understand your relationships with other people, even your good relationships with other people, because, you know, there's good parts about transference too, right? You know, you had a good relationship with your mom when you were an infant, and now you were able to experience love, and so now you're able to experience love in other parts of your life. So, you know, that's what we want to have, right? That's the kind of good things we want to have. So transference isn't there's not a valuative judgment about transference. It's not good or bad. But in therapy, you're going to be working with the stuff that obviously doesn't work for the person as an adult. So, you know, we tend to think of it as a bad thing, but it's not. There's lots of good things that go on in transference. And those are other things the patient will also learn, is the transference stuff that is mature and is useful in their life and constructive. And how they, you know, the realization that they do know how to love other people, they do know how to get along with other people. That's also very, very positive. Okay. All right. All right. Next thing. So again, patients not aware at a conscious level of transference taking place. They're expressing feelings that are inaccessible to the conscious mind. The thoughts are not they can't just think it up. Whatever they're doing, they have to feel it. Psychoanalytic clinician serves as sort of a movie screen, and patients unconsciously projecting their transferential pattern onto the screen. Right. So again, that's why neutrality is important, because neutrality means the screen is blank, and the patient can project their movie onto the screen, not project their movie over the therapist's movie, which is messy and nobody knows what's going on. Right. And again, I'll mention prequel to what I'm going to say later, that this is where therapists get in trouble. Then the psychoanalytic clinician will then work to decipher the pattern of transference to give insight about the nature of the patient's problems. This will include the developmental level where the problems originated, as well as patterns of relating that are typical for that developmental level. Okay. It will then interpret their insights to the patient. Over time, the patient will come to understand and be aware of their transference, how this affects their thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. In other words, the process of psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic therapy allows patients the opportunity to re-experience their important early relationships in a more satisfactory manner. This is labeled as a corrective emotional experience. Some people in the analytic world don't like this idea, but I think this is super important, so I put it in here. And over time, the psychoanalytic clinician interprets the transference patterns being exhibited. They become more and more conscious of their transference, starting with what goes on in the therapy hour and the here and now of the therapy hour. So when you're in that hour with your patient, you are there to experience the transference they are projecting onto you, and then to reflect the pattern back to them. That's basically what one of the main things you're doing while you're listening to them free associate, that kind of thing. Okay. Eventually, the patient will become to an understanding of their unconscious patterns. The unconscious patterns will be made conscious, and then they can relate this stuff to what's going on outside the therapy hour. Okay. And this will give more satisfying connections to other and a greater capacity for love and intimacy, which is something we all want. Okay. Got to maintain neutrality. You don't react to the transference pattern in the same way as significant people in the patient's past. Right. So in other words, your patient was a baby and they were breastfeeding, and the breast stopped giving them milk, and they became frustrated and bit in the milk, and their mother picked them up and threw them across the room. When they had that kind of frustration in the therapy hour with you, as if, they had bitten your nipple and you had, were throwing them across the room, you don't react by, obviously not physically throwing them across the room, but you don't react mentally as if you were throwing them across the room. You remain neutral. That allows the transference pattern to become more visible, more aware, okay? And you become a consistent presence for them. Also, maintaining consistency is very important, that you're a consistent presence. Your neutrality allows you to maintain consistency, that you're the same consistent neutral person every time. And then you emerge as something that has been termed the analytic object for the patient. In other words, the substitute for the maladaptive parenting, you become the new object for the patient. Okay, this gets repeated over and over and over again every session, and also through timely interpretation of what's going on. And then the person will start to make the stuff more conscious. It is more difficult and takes more time with borderline and narcissistic and schizophrenic transferences, because these are not as well put together. That's the easy way of saying it. We'll talk more about what's going on there later, okay? That makes sense to everybody? Okay, good. Okay, two types of transference, positive and negative. Positive, patients project their idealization of their early objects onto their parents. When you're a little kid, your parents are everything. Your mom is your whole world, and she gives you pleasure, makes you feel good, makes you feel loved. And so you idealize her, you project that onto your therapist. Okay, you over-idealize the therapist, develop strong feelings of love or even sexual attraction for the therapist, because, of course, as adults, our feeling of pleasure now becomes centered in the genitals, and they become centered in sexual attraction, even though as a baby, that wasn't the case. But as an adult now, they manifest as a sexual attraction. Okay. And so you'll have your patients falling in love with you, thinking you're the best therapist, you're the greatest, falling in love with you, all sorts of things. And then you'll get the negative transference, generally appears later. Negative transference, the patient becomes critical, resentful, angry, hostile, even aggressive, because now they're experiencing the negative things they had with their parents when the mother got frustrated with the kid. And and yelled at him, or did something that made the kid frustrated, or didn't feed the kid enough, or neglected the kid, or whatever it might be. That's the negative transference. That'll come later. Okay, usually the positive comes first because that's not as scary. But the negative transference, you have to have a good therapeutic alliance, and then the patient can feel enough of a connection to you to be able to manifest that without feeling you're going to kick them out of therapy or whatever it is. Okay. So there's now there's a lot of ambivalence in transference as well. So you'll get some of both. Things will come together. You'll get first the positive and then the negative, but you'll also get a little bit of negative with the positive and positive with the negative. Okay. Also can alternate between positive and negative. That's very common, especially with borderline people that alternate positive and negative all the time. Okay. Depending on the pattern of relationship that is playing out. Okay. The splitting defenses will cause like a rapid alternation, usually not necessarily rapid, but it'll cause an alternation of between positive and negative transference all the time. And it's really, really difficult to deal with. Okay. Rapid change is a hallmark of personality disorder. So rapid personality transference, positive to negative, rapid change can clue you in that there's some, borderline personality organization thing going on, personality disorder. Okay. Here's a case example, and then I want to maybe stop after this, and we'll go to start working on the papers. A woman in psychotherapy because she had trouble at work. She had difficult time relating to coworkers who thought her somewhat aloof. This was one of, I think this was my case. Somewhat aloof. She constantly sought out her male supervisor's attention to the point where he would avoid her if possible. When the woman couldn't get her supervisor's attention, she would end up calling in sick and not come to work. Every time she called in sick, she was required to report it to her supervisor, who had to keep track of the absence, and to tell her to get a doctor's note. This woman had grown up as a middle child in a large family with several brothers and sisters. During a therapy session, she revealed that her father worked long hours when she was a child. She didn't see him very much. However, if she became ill, her father would put his work aside and take care of her, paying attention to her and not her siblings. During individual therapy sessions, the woman would become somewhat cloying and annoying in her behavior, causing her therapist, i.e. me, to dread sessions with her. So I had countertransference to this woman, right? Countertransference. The woman also participated in group therapy sessions. This was a woman I saw individually and also saw her in group therapy once a week. In group therapy, she was come to group therapy sessions with myself, and I did the sort of old school psychoanalytic group therapy where we had two therapists, a male and a female, mom and dad, right? Therapy session. So during the therapy, she felt the group, some other group member received too much attention, she would often call in sick for subsequent sessions and request that I call her at home. Right. So imagine how this worked out, right? Call her home. What would I tell her? Say, show up for therapy. Let's talk about this when you come to the therapy hour. Let's talk about this when you get here, right? So she would come in, and then she would come in. She got attention from me, so then she would come in. And this is a good case because it really demonstrates how early relationships are recreated by the patient. In this case, the woman used something called projective identification, which we'll get to later. We'll talk more detail about that later. Which she's projected in her transference, she projected onto me qualities of the therapist that made me feel and behave the way her rejecting father did. In other words, my countertransference to her was how her father felt. Okay. And so I had to realize that and go, these countertransference films, these tell me something about what her father must have been like. And this clued me in a little bit to her, what was going on. So my job was not to act like her father, the rejecting father. My job was to remain consistent and neutral, which meant come into therapy, call her on the phone, you need to come into the hour, you need to come into therapy, right? So be very consistent about that. In the group therapy setting, when her fellow group members received attention from me, she would try to get my attention the same way she got attention from her father as a child, by not showing up, by calling in sick, right? So again, if you're a behaviorist, you can see what's going on here. She reinforced her father to give her attention by being sick. In other words, her behavior of being sick functions as a reinforcer to her father to give her attention, right? So she got attention by reinforcing, she knows she could get his attention. So that was a reinforcer. And likewise, if you're behaviorist, because behaviorism is tautological and circular, she was reinforced for being sick by getting attention from her father. Her father's attention reinforced her becoming sick. So she had that pattern that was reinforced for her. That's what she learned, and she would do that in therapy. She was completely unconscious about this. She didn't make the connection between her early childhood life and her work life and her work and what was going on in therapy when she wouldn't show up to therapy. And this is what, I had to first examine my countertransference reaction and then understand the patient's transference neurosis. So this was a good transference neurosis, right? She was neurotic. She wasn't borderline. She wasn't dissociating. She wasn't splitting. And I was able to interpret this to her very slowly. That she, it's interesting that I wonder if this reminds you of something having, how you interacted with your father when your father would, I wonder if, when you call in sick for work, is that, if that's similar to when, you got your father's attention when you were sick as a child, make some kind of transferences to her, so she could understand. Now, in this case, this woman was personality wise pretty well put together. And so I could make transference interpretations like that. And she could get it. It wasn't going to cause her to, if she'd been borderline, making an interpretation like that would probably cause her to start to decompensate. But she was really pretty well put together. Personality is pretty well put together. And she was smart. And so I can make interpretations like that and she would get it. But I had to do it over and over and over again. I'd make the interpretation, she would get it, the light bulb would go on. By the next session, she would have forgotten. She would have repressed it again. So there's some defensive mechanisms going on here as well, right? But what happened was that she was able to do this. She was able to see this. There was some other manifestations too with the female therapist, the jealousy, of the Oedipal stuff, right? The jealousy of wanting my attention and not wanting to give attention to mom, the other therapist, that came out also in the therapy. It was interpreted to her. And she was actually able to do really quite well. And, her work situation got better relatively quickly. I mean, I would say 6 to 8 months, her work situation really cleared up, and she had a much more realistic relationship with the boss and didn't lose her job. She was sort of almost on the verge of maybe losing her job. She was having a really hard time interacting with her bosses, and she was taking a lot of sick time. But about after 6 to 8 months, she was really able to work stabilized, and she was able to, and then she started working on her inability to have a relationship with a man, having a romantic relationship. And that's when we started getting into the more ethical stuff. It was really good. It's a very good case. She actually did very, very well. Okay. And she's also able to start having more genuine friendships with the other group members, her siblings, right? That also improves, and that's also was a really interesting thing to see. Okay. So that's my case study. It was a good case. I like that case. How much longer we have to go on this? Okay, I think maybe we'll stop here and we'll do the papers. And then next time I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about transference, and then we're going to talk about neutrality. Okay, so somebody remember where I was, Hannah? I'll let you remember where I was on the slide here, and then we'll get to that. And we're going to talk about we'll get into more neutrality, which is really important. So I don't want to rush through the neutrality stuff. Okay, any questions on anything anybody has? It's all good. All makes sense to everybody?